the innumerable things that Vince Scully taught us, I only have time to focus on three. First and foremost, he taught us an art history that none of us had heard before. His passionate, searing lectures glowed with familiar names, to be sure, Giotto, Michelangelo, Palladio, but also Picasso, Pollock, Louis Kahn, and Maya Lin. But he also focused, of course, on well-known historical figures like Jefferson and Louis XIV and his military engineer, Vauban. Vince had a historical imagination and left us with a palpable sense of history, of the ages rushing by and new vistas coming to the fore. But for Vince, the past was never really past. It was always intersecting with the present. In a moving lecture, he showed how some of Vauban's 17th century forts were flooded by the French during World War II in order to slow down the advance of Hitler's troops. And I remember the sense of bitter disappointment when the lights went on in the law school auditorium and we had to balloon down to planet Earth and readjust to our everyday existence. We wanted to stay on Vincent Scully's magic carpet in the company of these great men and women, Brunelleschi, Titian, George Washington, heroic figures like Vince himself, larger than life, generous, lion-hearted. And this epic yardstick, which he used in his lectures, was the only one, of course, by which we could use but the only one by which we could judge Vince Scully himself. It is not by chance, I think, that so many of his lectures touched on the subject of war. He wrote memorably about Michelangelo's fortification drawings for Florence, or those of Vauban, or of Edwin Lutyens' great memorial to the dead soldiers who died at the Battle of the Somme in World War I at Thiéval. There were still battles to be fought, battles that we had to fight. And Vince he fought for an art history that came down from the sacred groves of academe. And he was deeply, deeply concerned, involved, engaged in the contemporary world as an art historian. In 1989, when the Corcoran Gallery of Art bowed to pressure and canceled an exhibition of the work of Robert Mapplethorpe, Vince gave a stirring lecture about freedom of expression, reminding us that we had to stand up. Again and again, he brought up civil rights in lecture. And as President Levin and Bob Stern also have pointed out, when his beloved Yale threatened to tear down a building, Vince thundered at his alma mater, and the words he used in lecture to us students was that Yale acted like a, quote, mean little Yankee institution. Art history had to be militant and proactive. It had to intervene in the world around it. Second thing has already been brought up by Bob Stern. Vince taught us how to see. But the way he taught us how to see, Vince taught us how to teach. The way he treated us, the way he corrected us with humor so that we would not be humiliated, the way he vetted all our talks before we became ridiculous at symposia. He always vetted us. He gave us time. These were all invaluable lectures for the future. And there was also his and Tappy's warm hospitality in their home. And in every one of those dinners, every time, Tappy would begin a story and pause in mid-sentence, and Vince would finish the phrase for her. It wasn't until many years later, when I myself was married, that I was aware of how unusual that was, a husband and wife with the same version of the same event. You were a partnership, working closely with one another, and that too was a lesson that stayed with us. Finally, and here I come to Bob Stern's point, Vince taught us how to see. But for Vince, seeing was not something passive. It wasn't something that just happened. It required work, commitment, risk, and always imagination. All of us who studied with Vince have taken detours of 100 miles or more to see something he had mentioned in lecture. And how many of us grad students would find ourselves one day in a back country road in Italy under a torrential downpour, waiting for a bus that might come in an hour or two or a day or two. You look down your clothes, your new leather shoes were ruined. Mud falls oozing out, but you didn't care. We had just seen a Palladian villa that Vince had mentioned, and we knew that our life was enriched, amplified by this experience. But Vince could never teach us to see the way that he did, because he had an exceptional ability to compare things that were separated by thousands of years, for example, or thousands of miles. And when he made these startling connections, he was always right. And a striking example of this has already been brought up by Professor Levin, was this precisely the parallel that he brought up between the urban plan of New Haven and Ezekiel's vision of the ideal city, 9 perfect squares with 12 gates and a temple in the center facing the sea. But Vince was not about pure formal analogy. It was always something more. He was always after the bigger picture. And he adds, quote, "It is touching that the city Ezekiel described is intended as a refuge for the people who left Jerusalem after Jerusalem was taken and destroyed." As he wrote in Yale and New Haven, Architecture and Urbanism, the book he co-authored with Tabby, Paul Goldberger, and Eric Vogt, New Haven is Ezekiel's vision to the life, the 9-square city by the sea, the red mountain flaring. It is the New Jerusalem, the most perfect of all the Puritan towns. And we shall now hear the Society of Orpheus and Bacchus sing a version of Jerusalem that was rewritten in order to reflect Vincent Scully's vision of his native city as the New Jerusalem.